Okay, let's take a look at what's at our feet. This is pretty and green, but it's obviously where the cows are grazing. Are you able to find any native plants?
No, this is all introduced weeds. I think this is like scarlet pimpernel. There's a pile of manure. These are annual grasses. Here's poison hemlock coming up. Here's a milk thistle. This is from Europe. Yep, milk thistle from Europe.
Yeah, those always feel good too.
Yeah, so they're not that edible to cattle. So we have a high percentage of weeds, but look at this soil patch here. There's no moss. It's very hard. It's not spongy. No delicate lichens. There's no biological soil crust. It's a desert. The soil is a desert here.
All right, so while we're standing in this field full of just invasive plants, 100% non-native plants, I want to talk about a blog post from a range department at an ag school who brought her ag students out here to demonstrate that cattle grazing actually was good for native plants. And I'm not seeing that evidence. How can you explain the results that she's claiming? I don't understand what's happening with that.
I think there's a big bias towards agriculture claiming that this type of grazing and weed fields of 100% introduced plants. There's not a single native plant where we're standing in all these hills here. I think that's a skewing of that cattle can help, because we've just looked at the biological soil crust, the coastal prairie. There's rare species that can benefit from some open habitat, such as Sonoma alopecuris, which is a small native annual grass that likes vernal pools. And why not use elk? Elk can graze these areas. They have been for thousands of years. The Sonoma alopecuris grass has obviously coexisted with elk. So if it needs a little bit of grazing, the elk can certainly provide that. And as far as other rare species, there are forbs such as violets that are host to rare checker spot butterflies and other butterflies. I have seen those on ungrazed roadsides at Point Reyes. So if there are occasionally some in grazed pastures, I think it's just they're holding on. And if we could maintain open, native, resilient, healthy coastal prairie, we would do a much better job. And a program of prescribed fire, elk grazing, that is probably all we need to have a mosaic of open native grassland and shrub cover of native shrubs like coyote brush for birds.
So it's a little bit misleading, if I may be so bold, to just talk about grazing in general as possibly beneficial, but leaving out the fact that cows aren't the only option for grazing.
Right. Elk are grazers, and they have maintained a lot of open habitat at Tamales Point. And the bull elk with their big antlers will even horn, it's called, wipe and thrash the coyote brush with their antlers, and that gets rid of some. So there are definitely other options for grazing and keeping habitats open.
I'm going to read directly from the blog post. PRNS staff concluded that Marin dwarf flax may benefit from a moderate level of cattle grazing through the reduction of taller competing vegetation, as the flax is subject to shading by competing grasses, or may be suppressed by buildup of thatch from previous year's herbage if left ungrazed.
And Tule elk could completely fulfill that. If we had a free-roaming herd of Tule elk and we carefully managed the flax along with elk, that's what the flax was evolved with for 10,000 years. Also, the Coast Miwok here had a system of patch cultural burning, which I think also reduced thatch in small patches, and that also could benefit the flax. And I know that park staff used to have a pretty good prescribed fire program, so they could definitely replace cattle with fire and Tule elk.
I also noticed that they used the word may. This is referred to as a conclusion, but it's a non-conclusive conclusion.
Correct.
It may benefit. So the best thing that this could come up with at the end of it is that it may benefit. I'll also point out that this tour was conducted by someone from an ag school hosted by ranchers.
I think that could be a little biased, and I think there needs to be more outside research and a lot more published scientific peer-reviewed studies to say what other disturbance regimes such as fire and tule outgrazing could also benefit the flax, not just maybe cattle. I think that's a pretty biased statement.
The Livestock Advisor's blog post goes on to call native coyote brush invasive, but you can watch that in the video entitled Invasive Natives. Right now, what I want to draw attention to are the trends that can be found in publications claiming the benefits of cattle grazing to native plants. While one might hope that a topic based in ecology would stick with science, you will instead regularly find economics and culture thrown in for sway. These have nothing to do with nature, nor the status of native plants and animals. And while some may feel that tradition and money are worthy excuses for damaging native flora and fauna, if one is trying to present a case based on scientific evidence, then stick with the scientific evidence. From this particular example, let's look at this paragraph. Sonoma and Marin counties are perfect models for demonstrating how preserving family farms contribute to social, economic, and ecological sustainability at local, regional, and even national levels. Ranching, Point Reyes National Seashore, albeit smaller scale, remains a local industry which provides job creation, training, and business succession, and market expansion for many other ranchers and farmers. Now, whether you agree with that paragraph or not, it was about 90% based on economics and social issues, with the word ecological thrown into the mix once. But the evidence supporting the ecological aspect of the argument was blurry at best. The next line states, research has demonstrated that livestock ranching maintains extensive open spaces by reducing land use conversion, fragmentation of habitat, and vegetation type conversion from invasion of brush. Vegetation type conversion from invasive brush. When in reality, we're talking about a history of ranchers converting native brush into livestock grazing vegetation. For those of you who have been watching the series, every time Laura and I walk into a field with cattle grazing, the biodiversity is reduced, the invasive plants increase, and the native plants disappear, while the opposite happens when we enter non-grazed areas. That's real. That's evidence anyone can bear witness to, without a veil of vaguely referenced pro-cattle research and mentions of culture and economics. But let me read the next line. Threats to native biodiversity, including special status species, are likely to increase with removal or decrease of grazing. Research and experience have shown that grazing is strongly linked to maintaining habitat for some special status species on PRNS lands, while they have been inconclusive for others. Well, Laura and I couldn't have proven this to be more untrue even if we had scripted our visit to the seashore. In that paragraph, again, are vague generalities such as likely and some species, while in another section the blog refers to species that occur only in Point Reyes National Seashore. That's because that's where those plants are native to. The fact that some still survive there is not thanks to the ranchers, but despite the ranchers. And now at this point, defeatist arguments will come in saying things like, hey, well, would you rather have a parking lot or apartment complex? How would the plants do then? That's like saying I need to be thankful that someone is threatening me with an A-bomb instead of an H-bomb. And instead of staying on the topic of whether or not cattle grazing is beneficial to the native habitat, the topic changed to, well, hey, it could be even worse. This is a moot point anyway because, and I understand that it's easy to forget because there's private ranching taking place here, but this is already a federally purchased national park. The only way that development of any kind could take place here is if the park administration should choose to allow that to happen. All this before even mentioning that those largely responsible for the removal of native animals, including grazers, to make way for their livestock, are also the ones now saying that we need their grazers to do the jobs of the animals they are responsible for eradicating in the first place. Since economic and societal concerns will always influence these sorts of reports, I recommend that people go back and imagine themselves in the innocence of their youth. Let's say back in a second grade classroom. The teacher says, "Class, here we have a sensitive native habitat that has co-evolved with the native animals for thousands of years. Now we're going to unleash large numbers of non-native, voracious grazing animals on that habitat. Will the results be good or bad for that native habitat?" When you remove pro-agriculture bias, the answer becomes that simple. Is introducing a non-native animal good to a native environment?